Hi friends, this is Justin from Why Catholic. I really appreciate everyone who has donated to keep this podcast going. And so I thought, wouldn't it be great if people could support this podcast but also get something in return? So I created a Why Catholic merch shop. You can find it on Etsy, just search for Why Catholic. And I've also linked to it in the show notes. These designs are 100% original. I wanted to make something that shares our faith but also looks trendy. You can find t-shirts, hats, sweatshirts, and more. And I'm constantly adding to the store as well. Stay tuned to the end of the podcast to hear how you can get a special discount. Thanks so much for supporting Why Catholic. Hi, this is Justin Hibbard, and you're listening to Why Catholic, my podcast about the what and why of Catholicism. We have been talking about the Sacrament of Holy Orders, which pertains to the offices of bishop, priests, and deacons. In episode 38, we dove into the Jewish roots of holy orders. In episode 39, we talked about the apostolic succession and how Jesus' authority was passed down to his apostles, and then they appointed bishops to carry out the ministry in an unbroken line of succession. In episode 41, I shared an interview with Father John Paul Kern, who is a former high school classmate of mine and has since converted to Catholicism and become a priest in the Dominican order. Today, we're going to talk about the role of deacons, and to help me, I had the opportunity to interview my deacon, Deacon Tom Tosti. Before we get to the interview, let's talk a little bit about the role of deacons. We find the introduction to this office in Acts chapter 5. It says, quote, "Now during those days, when the disciples were increasing in number, the Hellenists complained against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution of food. And the 12 called together the whole community of the disciples and said, 'It is not right that we should neglect the word of God in order to wait on tables. Therefore, friends, select from among yourselves 7 men of good standing, full of the Spirit and of wisdom, whom we may appoint to this task, while we, for our part, will devote ourselves to prayer and to serving the word.' What they said pleased the whole community, and they chose Stephen, a man full of faith and the Holy Spirit, together with Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, and Nicholas, a proselyte of Antioch. They had these men stand before the apostles, who prayed and laid hands on them." End quote. The purpose of the diaconate, or the deacons, was to serve. In fact, the word deacon means servant. Deacons assisted the apostles by caring for widows, distributing food, and so forth. This wasn't a pedestrian role that was just given to anyone. We see that the apostles bestowed authority on them by the laying of hands. They were men in good standing and full of the Spirit and of wisdom. In fact, the first recorded Christian martyr was one of these original 7 deacons, Stephen. St. Ignatius of Antioch, who was martyred around 106 AD, declared that the office of the deacon is, quote, "the ministry of Jesus Christ," end quote. He also made the following observation, quote, "The deacons, too, who are ministers of the mysteries of Jesus Christ, should please all in every way, for they are not servants of food and drink, but ministers of the Church of God." He continues on, "Correspondingly, show the deacons respect. They represent Jesus Christ just as the bishop has the role of the Father, and the presbyters or priests are like God's council and an apostolic band. You cannot have a church without these," end quote. Deacons were like the eyes and ears of the bishops and priests. Whereas the bishops oversaw a region of churches, and whereas the priests led the liturgies and sacraments in individual churches, the deacons really focused on ministering to the people and leading efforts of charity. The first 400 years of Christianity is considered the golden era of the diaconate. With a steady transformation of the presbyterate, or role of priests, we see a decline in the office of deacons. By the end of the 4th century, they were no longer considered part of the bishop's personal staff. Instead, they served the local priests as assistants, and because the relationship between priests and deacons was never officially defined, the diaconate eventually disappeared in the Western churches around 475 AD. One of the major reforms that came out of the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s was redefining and reestablishing the office and role of the diaconate. In the interview, you're going to hear Deacon Tom talk about how his father was part of the first class of deacons after Vatican II revived it. You'll also hear him use the term ordinary and extraordinary ministers. Ordinary ministers refer to those members of the clergy, whereas an extraordinary minister is a layperson doing some of the tasks that typically a cleric would do. For example, when distributing the Eucharist at Mass, priests often rely on extraordinary Eucharistic ministers, lay people who help the priest in giving the Eucharist to the congregation. I want to dive into the interview now, but let me preface it by introducing you to Deacon Tom. Deacon Tom serves the Archdiocese of Salt Lake. Specifically, he spends the majority of his time with St. Mary's Church in Park City. My earliest memory of Deacon Tom was at a Mass leading up to Easter. It was one of the weeks of scrutiny where adult catechumens, which are those considering becoming Catholic, are brought to the front of the church. Deacon Tom always preaches at these scrutinies because he leads the RCIA program at St. Mary's. RCIA stands for Rite of Christian Initiation for Adults. It's the class all teenagers and adults take when they are converting to Catholicism. Deacon Tom's sermon that day focused on the encounter between Jesus and the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4. Here's a snippet from his homily. Quote, "Many people think that the RCIA program is all about knowledge, all about learning about the Catholic Church, and partly it is, but mostly it is about falling in love. There are lots of people who have knowledge of the church and its teachings, but not a lot of us are actually in love with it. There are lots of people who have a rudimentary knowledge of Jesus, but not a lot of us are actually in love with him, because knowledge is not enough." He went on to say, "We are all the woman at the well. We all have a past that includes things we aren't particularly proud of. We all have sinned, and we have felt the worthlessness sin can bring, and we have all encountered Jesus in some way or other. Some of us have moved our relationship with him to another level, to the level of trust. Some of us have gone all the way to love. We have fallen in love with Jesus." End quote. That stood out to me because I was raised believing that Catholics just went through the motions of religion, emotionless about a relationship with God. Deacon Tom set the record straight that day. All of Catholicism is about falling in love with Jesus. A few months later, I got to know Deacon Tom and his wife Nancy really well. When my kids and I were considering becoming Catholic, they had us over to hear our story and talk with us about the process. Then we entered into the RCIA program and met with them every week from September to April. Deacon Tom truly has a servant's heart. On top of being a deacon, he works full-time at Franklin Covey, and he has his own business called Tecton Woodworks, where he makes stunning liturgical pieces made of wood, metal, and stone. Here's my interview with Deacon Tom Tosti. Well, thank you, Deacon Tom, for taking time to talk with me today on Why Catholic. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I love talking about this stuff.
So tell me a little bit about your Catholic upbringing to begin.
Oh, well, I often make the comments that I'm cradle to grave. So I was born to a large Italian Catholic family. I was adopted into that family, actually, in Massachusetts. And so it was very, very cultural. All my family had all the events, the meals, the special festivals and things like that. My grandmother used to have all the little saints lined up on her bureau, these little statues of all the saints and stuff, and she'd pray to them every night. And so it was really cultural. But then my family moved to Southern California when I was 9, so we were very separated from the rest. My father was a very devout Catholic. He was a charismatic Catholic. And so I was actually part of that when I was 10, 11, 12 years old. We used to go to Loyola Marymount, where Father Hampsh was doing all the Southern California renewal community for charismatics. And so my father spoke in tongues, and I was slain in the spirit and all those kinds of things. So I was very emotionally attached to my faith. It wasn't just something that was cultural. And so then that's sort of what has followed through. I still consider myself to be a charismatic, even though it's probably just the internal workings of the Spirit that I'm much more aware of. But it was probably my father's influence mostly that led me to the diaconate. In fact, he was in the first discernment class back, I think, in 1972 or 1973 in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. But then he came down with esophageal cancer. And so, actually, cancer of the larynx, so he couldn't speak. So he had to drop out of all that. But when he died, like 15 years ago, I was going through his papers, and I found actually his application to the Archdiocese for the Diaconate. And so, so I guess it was sort of meant to be that I would follow in those footsteps.
Tell me a little bit about that process. What made you decide that you were interested in becoming a deacon?
It's changed, and probably it isn't necessarily a very pure journey. It wasn't very altruistic. It wasn't that I felt this amazing calling and so forth. I had always thought, I considered the priesthood when I was younger, and then got into high school and discovered girls, and that all went away. Especially because the girl I discovered in high school is still my wife 40 years later. So, but I don't know, it was sort of like I was so involved in the church. I was a lector, Eucharistic minister, parish council president, all those things. So I was really, really involved. I was a catechist, did a lot of with RCIA, which is where I met you. And so I had all the stuff. I was very well prepared from a skill standpoint. But I think when I first looked at it, I thought it was being more like an honor. It was something, it was probably clericalism to a large degree. It was like, oh yeah, I'm up here, I'm doing all these things, and so why not? So let's make it official kind of a thing. It's very much changed over the last 20 years.
How so?
Father Bob, our former pastor, told me once when I was discerning that the church ordained him a priest, but his people made him a pastor. So I always say that the church ordained me a deacon, but the people have made me a servant, what deacon means and stuff. Very humbling ministry. And so I think I've shed a lot of those pretenses that that maybe have led me to that. But really, it was, hey, I got all the skills, why not? Yeah. Whereas I'm a little different from the other deacons I know, especially in the diocese, the guys I formed with. They're all older. I was 42 when I was ordained, so I was the second youngest in my class. Most of the permanent deacons in the United States are older. And they're all these real sweet guys, and they got this, this wonderful spirituality, and they're just so gentle, and I ain't gentle. I'm more the bull in the china shop. So it takes me a lot of butting my heads against the wall to finally figure out what I'm supposed to be doing and who I am. So making a lot of mistakes.
So when you decided that you wanted to become a deacon, how did that conversation go with your family? Well,
Nancy, she always knew that I was interested. And we before we moved to Park City, we lived in Idaho, and they didn't have a program there. They didn't have a permanent diaconate. So I really wanted to do it. And when we first came here and I found out that they were reinstituting it, because it had been sort of dormant for a while, I just jumped right on it. I talked to Father Bob and said, I want to do this. So I wasn't like called to it. I went to him and said, I think I'm being called to this. And then I got involved in the entire formation process. And a year into it, we lost our bishop. And then we didn't have a bishop for 2 or 3 years in interregnum there. And so we had no program. So it stopped. And then when we got the new bishop in, Bishop Niederauer, had to start all over again. So usually it was a 4-year program. I had a 5-year program.
Oh, wow.
So...
And what is that process?
It is, well, when I first was going through, there were no national directives. Now there are. It's 1,000 hours in the classroom, 1,000 hours in the parish work.
Okay.
Doing a practicum there. So it's very much, it's more of it's sort of like the equivalent of a master's in pastoral theology.
Okay.
Not systematic, it's pastoral. It's really, the hands-on workings kind of thing. So.
And I was surprised to find out that the formation of the diaconate is fairly new, like the mid 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
How have you seen it evolve over time?
Well, I think what they did, and interestingly, a really close friend of my family's growing up was in the first class of deacons in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, and this was like in the early 70s, and it was almost like they didn't know what they were doing. Actually, the restoration of the permanent diaconate was one of the first things that was promulgated out of Vatican II, even before, I think, the liturgy. And so they really didn't know. It's almost like they were just, we have a need, but you need to ordain a bunch of guys. I've heard of classes where they just, okay, it's 30 men, boom, you're all deacons. And so they found there were a lot of gaps in that we didn't have the foundation to be able to understand and explain not just church teachings, doctrine, but who the church is. And so even it was after I was ordained in 2004 that they came out and said, no, we're going to really tighten things up. You have to, I think you have to have a college degree now in the U.S. There's exceptions, of course, but there's a pretty stringent, they have to be able to handle the academic part of it as well. So you would have to be able to do well in a college type of a setting. And in most dioceses, it's attached to a college or university, Catholic university. We don't have that here in Utah. And so I was formed by the dean of the theology department at Mount Angel Seminary in Mount Angel, Oregon. And Owen Cummings, who's a very famous, well-respected deacon. He would fly in like every other weekend, and we'd spend all weekend with him, stuff. But that's how we had. Now I think we're relying mostly on priests and local theologians and clergy and stuff to help form the guys.
I guess a question is like, were your kids older then? Because I know a lot of deacons, they tend to become deacons when the kids grow up and are leaving the house. What's your experience? Mine were teenagers. I was ordained in 2004. My son graduated high school in 2003, and my daughter in 2006. So it was, and that's really a shame. And I know that we're actually now looking for younger men, because in the United States, the average age is over 60, but in the rest of the world, it's in the 40s. And they wanted to make sure, I think, about stability, that you have a stable marriage, that your wife is supportive of this, that your children, your family is doing okay, because it is a big time commitment. And but I think that it really, if you think about it, I think that the norm is that you have to be at least 35 when you enter the program. And so we need more younger men. We need, we're out there and we have our careers and we have everything else we don't think about because we have kids. We can't have a career. Why not this? Mm-hmm. And so they have the energy. They have that different point of view. It's not just a bunch of baby boomers out there with a 1960s attitude of things. So, what are the main roles and responsibilities of being a deacon?
Well, it is a ministry of service at the altar. We're a ministry of the Word. We are ordinary ministers of the Word. We teach and we preach. We read the Gospel at Mass. So we actually have a lot of sacramental responsibilities, doing baptisms, funerals, weddings, things like that. And then, but it's a ministry of charity, where we are like that bridge. Do a lot of work out in the community. It was always that way. I mean, look at the first 7 deacons were, because the apostles, we shouldn't be waiting on tables. Usually, you guys take care of the widows. You do all that. And so we work in the community, work with the poor, prisoners, the sick, the dying, the grieving, things like this. We are considered the ordinary ministers of these things, but everything a deacon can do, a layperson can do. In a pinch or an emergency. You could baptize somebody if you had to. You can preside at a funeral, not a funeral mass. You could do a wedding. All these kinds of things. But it's sort of like we're the ordinary ministers of that. But we have extraordinary helpers all throughout. Mm-hmm. So, but it's mainly, we're sort of like that bridge from the community to the church. And that's the reason why it always was that way. It was like you're working out in the community, in the town, with the people, and then you would be that link to the community at liturgy. That's one reason, for example, why we say the prayers of the faithful. It was like we're bringing the prayers from the community to the liturgy so we all can pray on them. That kind of a thing. So it's sort of like I'll go back and I'll go visit the sick and whatever, and I'll tell Father, well, this so-and-so needs the anointing, or this person needs this person needs that. So it's also directing resources and things. So that's primarily what it is. Although a lot of deacons do administrative work. They might run a parish, or they might do hospital ministries, or things outside of the parish. We actually are ordained for the diocese, not for the parish. So I work for the bishop. I work with my pastor, and he supervises, but I actually have, made my obedience to the bishop, and he can, send me to hospitals, work in the diocese, the diocesan offices, whatever he might be. It's not just done parish work.
Okay. So then what are the logistics like as far as where you spend your time, like going to the sick, going to the hospitals, maybe people that are shut in, and like who decides where someone's going?
This is actually something that is, to a large degree, up to you. When you get, where are your strengths, where are your charisms? But we actually have contracts that we sign with our pastors. I think it's to also limit that they don't take advantage, But I usually go 10 to 15 hours a week just in general. But my charisms and my strength, I think, are teaching and preaching. So that's what I do most. Then I also do a lot of work with the sick and the dying and the grieving. And that just sort of because, you have shut-ins, you have people in the hospitals, you need to have people come see them and bring them communion, things like this. Other men are doing, I know one guy who's retired Air Force, he's up at Hill Air Force Base. And so he works with the families of the people who are deployed. And he has those kinds of things he does. So there's so many different needs in the community. You find your place, and then and that's where you usually do your work.
So on top of being a deacon, you have a full-time job. Mm-hmm. You have a side business doing carpentry and building church furniture. Mm-hmm. How do you manage it all?
My kids are out of the house. And then Nancy and I, from the very beginning, and we met in high school, and for so many years we've worked together. So this is also, I think, a little bit unique in the diaconate in Utah, is that we do everything together. We do, if I have a wedding, she's our main wedding coordinator. She works all the weddings. She helps me set up for baptism, funerals. She's the administrator for the RCIA. So we do a lot of those ministries together. We run our liturgical design business together. She does all the administrative work. I would do the design, the sales, and most of the fabrication. My career is at Franklin Covey as a consultant is, everything sort of ties all together. I got the job at Franklin Covey because one of our parishioners saw me teach and preach and said, "You'd be a great training consultant. So why don't you do that?" So I did. He offered me a job. I understand liturgy, so I can, and I'm a master woodworker, so I can design and build, and found a niche with liturgical furnishings and things. So it all just sort of, builds on itself. My work doing leadership training and things like this helped me with my teaching. And then all of this is also, I was an English minor and a film major and things like this, so it helps me with my preaching and the way I write and things like this. So everything in my careers has sort of all been working together. So.
Speaking of which, one of the big responsibilities that you've taken on for a long time is RCIA, which is September to April, pretty much. Well, it's supposed to be year round, but we just don't have the resources. In fact, this is the first year that I've actually had consistent help on the team, yourself included, to help prepare people. But it was an interesting, funny story. I've told you this before. So I was 27 years old in a little church in Haley, Idaho, and I really didn't know anything about my faith, even though I'd gone through, Jesuit university and all those kinds of things. I didn't know anything. And the priest was going on sabbatical, and he said, "Could you teach a couple of classes? We have some adults who are looking to become Catholic," and gives me these binders and a couple of classes. That's now been 35 years, has grown into it. So, and hundreds of people who we've journeyed along with. But I think that I didn't know anything about my faith really, until you teach it. And so that's where I really learned it. And I learned apologetics
probably very similar to your journey on that, but it's more just answering questions, being with people as they're going through their journeys of faith. And I have gone through and done other certificates and stuff more formally, but mostly it's just doing it.
Yeah.
Stuff. So
there's nothing like teaching that'll teach you to learn.
But it's not just teaching, and as you know, in this process, you've been through it. It is truly forming small Christian communities, and you really, really come to know the practical applications of your faith and the problems that people have with it. Versus, hey, I know theology. You got to know the theology, but you got to be able to put in the language people can understand.
Yeah, absolutely.
And by doing all the other ministries, especially to the dying and the sick, when they're the most vulnerable, that's when you really learn that everything we do is just a ministry of presence, just being there for people, and not worrying so much about all the other stuff.
What advice would you give to someone who was discerning whether to become a deacon?
Well, look at it from various different. It's like any vocation in the church, or even vocation just in general. How did you discern what kind of job or career you wanted, or who you're going to ask to marry you, and things like this? You have criteria that you discern against, and but there'll be an inner voice. There'll be something within you that it's going to be tugging at you and bothering you. And so sort of like when you fall in love, I really don't feel right unless I'm with that person. And so that's the one thing. Pray, obviously, and listen to other people. I told you I went and I thought I was being called. I went to the pastor, but our other deacon, Deacon Bob, he was called by the pastor and myself, and said, "Hey, have you ever thought of this?" So we always tell our newly baptized, when they're looking for their place in the church, is if someone comes up to you and says, "Have you ever thought about doing this?" Don't just discount it, because oftentimes the Spirit has moved them to ask you because they see something in you might not see. So that's a very strong indicator if other people are asking you about it. But pray about it, obviously. Test out a lot of these things. Not everybody they might feel they're called to it. They might not have the skill set. They might not have the personality for it. It's not whether you're an introvert, extrovert, or whatever. It's really, how is your emotional intelligence level? How are you at relating with people? How empathetic can you be? How compassionate can you be? And then just realize that it's not up to you, really. And there's a whole team of people who will be helping you discern. Once you're accepted into the program, you are constantly evaluated. Not as much as a priest is, but there's a psychological, you have a spiritual director. They'll be evaluating your progress throughout the whole thing. And Archbishop Niederauer said to us once, he said, if I come to you a month before your scheduled ordination and say, we all think that really this is not what you're being called to, you should be disappointed, but not destroyed. No one has a right to any ministry. It's the church actually discerns and calls you as well. So, and I actually almost dropped out 6 months before my ordination. I didn't think I was worthy. I didn't think I was the right thing. And then Father Bob said, he's calling you, and the church will ordain you as you are. They know how you are, and so with all the warts and everything. So I bet you every priest would tell you the same thing.
What has been the biggest blessing for you as a deacon?
People let you into their lives, oftentimes at the most vulnerable stages, just because of who you are. I can say things and do things just because I'm a deacon that you can't. You'd have to earn that a little bit more. It's sort of like you get the badge, you get the uniform, you get that respect, or they'll expect you to say and do certain things. But I thought I was really frightened of working with people who were very sick What am I going to say? Am I going to screw it up? And yeah, I did. And I do. But it's very humbling. And I think what it is helping me do is prepare for my own death. That's actually a thing, having a prepared death. That you are ready, that your life is lived a certain way and you'll die a certain way. And so by experiencing and going through these journeys with these people, it's really softened me, and it's helped me to, I think, prepare for my own mortality. It does get tough sometimes. I mean, I've had, just last year alone, 6 of my close friends died, and I say, well, I got to help another one die. I got to help another one die. And you can get compassion fatigue. And it's sort of like, who's there to counsel the counselor? So you really also have to have a very strong support system in this. So I think, that's the thing mostly personally. I hope it's been helping me in my other relationships, closer relationships. You also have to balance it. You can be tugged in many different ways and neglect your family. Neglect other things because you think, oh, I got to do this. Church wants me to do it. Father wants me to do it. You got to know how to say no. You got to have a strong sense of what your boundaries are. So.
All right, last question. Question I like to ask people at the end of interviews is, the title of this podcast is called Why Catholic? If someone came up to you and said, hey, why are you Catholic, other than you were born into a Catholic family, what would be your answer? Well,
it's actually what I'm going to be preaching on this weekend, because it's the raising of Lazarus. And we all have what is truth and who is truth. And I've come throughout my discernment, my prayer, my experience to believe that Catholicism is the fullest expression of the truth. And I think that's important. So I'm there mostly because I believe it's true. Alongside that is the Eucharist. If it weren't for the actual body, being able to receive the body and blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ, to get that close to my Creator and to my Savior, that is so amazing. And to be able to bring the world to the transcendent to the world, to be that, on both sides there. So, but mostly I think it's because I wholly believe that it is the truth, and I think it's important to follow the truth, and that there is one truth, not my truth, your truth. There are things that are true. So it gives me comfort and sense of stability as well. But it's also meeting people like you and all the cool folks and their journeys and being able to share in their lives and their joys and their sufferings, and help to make sense of all the senseless things that are out there.
It's hard to imagine the Catholic Church without the role of deacons for nearly 1,500 years. In an era where there is a shortage of priests, deacons, especially today, do so much in helping carry out the mission of the Church. I want to thank Deacon Tom for joining me for this interview and for his integral role in our family's Catholic journey. And I want to thank all the deacons out there serving the Catholic Church. In the show notes, I provided a few links. The first is to Deacon Tom's business, Tecton Woodworks. Take a minute to peruse his portfolio. The work he's done is truly stunning. The second link is to an archive of Deacon Tom's sermon on his blog called Turbo Catholic. He is such a gifted preacher. The third link is to an article in the Salt Lake Tribune entitled Deacon Tom Builds Faith and Furniture. Take a look at those links. Thank you for joining me for Why Catholic. Be sure to subscribe to Why Catholic wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to my Substack site and get the next episode in your email inbox. As a subscriber, you get a special discount code to the Why Catholic Etsy store. If you've been blessed by this podcast and you're feeling generous, there's also a way to financially support it, and patrons get some extra perks. To become a free subscriber or a patron, just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Also join me on Instagram at whycatholicpodcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening. My name is Justin Hibbard, and this is Why Catholic. God bless you.